Our next session is Why Geography Matters with Nicholas Crane, writer, geographer and cartographic expert, in conversation with Julia Wheeler, journalist and interviewer as part of the Stanford's Travel Writers Festival. Now, this is a pre-recorded interview, but for those of you who would like to ask Nicholas any questions, he will be live on the chat function from 11:45 to answer as many of your questions as possible. We are all geographers, human beings who care about the places we think of as home, our habitat. Every day, we're being confronted by geographical stories from climate change, dwindling resources, polluted oceans, to migration and natural hazards. Nicholas makes the compelling case that never has geography been so important. Join them after this.
For 7 years now, the Stanford's Travel Writers Festival has been proud to be a part of Destinations, bringing inspirational talks from explorers, adventurers, historians, novelists, TV personalities, and many more of the very best travel authors. To delve into our treasure trove of travel books, maps, the greatest selection of globes in the world, and the rest of our 24-event festival lineup, head to stanfords.co.uk and we'll see you right here in your very own front row for the Stanford's Travel Writers Festival 2021.
Hello and welcome to the Stanford's Travel Writers Festival, to this session. Thanks for finding us, thanks for being here, thanks for coming on the journey with us in this extraordinary year. It's my absolute pleasure and delight to welcome back to Stanford's one of our very favourite authors, somebody who's been up there on the stage in the corner of Olympia on many an occasion, and I'm delighted to say that he's joining us from his home now. Nick Crane, welcome back.
Hello Julia, lovely to see you and to be with Stanford again.
We're going to be talking about all sorts of things. I don't know where this conversation will roam, but I know that it will be fascinating. I'd like to start with your book, Why Geography Matters, the title of that book, Why Geography Matters. And you say that the main premise of this is that the great age of geography is now upon us. How so?
Well, yes, I'll try and keep the answer concise, because in many ways we've always been in a great age of geography. But what I mean by that is that we've reached that point in the human occupation of the planet where we really have to take geography on board as the subject that will define our futures. One of the many definitions of geography is interconnectedness, the idea that parts of our planet, both human and physical, are all interconnected, and that there are effects, that knock-on effects. If you interfere with one part of the planet, there will be implications in other parts, and you can see that with the water cycle, which is one of the four main cycles of the planet, and the way that, if you imagine a water droplet evaporating from the ocean, being carried inland and then condensing, for example, in clouds over mountains, and then falling as rain or snow, then flowing down mountain streams and then rivers into estuaries and back into the ocean. You can see that at any one point in that cycle, a water droplet can be interfered with, and it could be pollution while it's in the waters. It could be coastal sea defences when it's being rammed up against the land in storms. Every single part of the planet is connected to other parts, and we've reached that point where there are so many of us living on the planet and exacting so many demands upon it that the future has become rather critical. And the more of us that understand the way basic geography works, the easier we're going to find it to adapt to the changes that are already in the pipeline.
The phrase tipping point comes to mind in what you've just been saying, and we're often hearing, almost continually hearing about we're reaching a tipping point. If we go beyond this, we won't be able to pull back, and so on and so forth. There are plenty of warnings. are we fatigued by those warnings? And is that why it sometimes feels difficult to take any action?
That's such a good question, Julia. And I think just the two words tipping point are part of the problem. Once we start thinking in too fateful a way about tipping points, there's a temptation to give up, just to think, well, that we can't get past that tipping point. There is no future. We have always, as human beings, had to live with tipping points. They're nothing new. For example, there's a little known but rather fascinating Mesolithic hunter-gatherer site in the south of Wales on the coast, where archaeologists have discovered that in a midden containing the shells of sea creatures they were harvesting from the intertidal zone, that the shells were getting smaller and smaller the further up the midden, the rubber sheep, they came. So basically the hunter-gatherers consumed all of the food they could on that section of the coast until the animals were too small to eat. Then they moved on somewhere else. So they reached their own local tipping point there, and that was thousands of years ago. So we've always harvested and extracted more than was supportable. The trick now, and it goes back to your question about why geography matters and the great age of geography, is that we simply have now to live within our means. It's completely essential. But to answer your question, and I don't think tipping points are massively helpful as a headline to live with, because of what you've just said. It encourages the idea that it's too late to do anything, whereas it's not. And what we have to do is adapt. We have to find a way through 1.5 degrees, for example, of climate change, global warming, through to perhaps 2 degrees, which is very serious. And the UN reckons the difference between 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2 degrees centigrade of global warming will be hundreds of millions of people put into poverty, which is truly appalling.
So to bring it down from that grand idea of the tipping point and the sort of the good versus evil, my feeling is that it has to be on a more local level. People have to understand that what they do today has an effect tomorrow. So I wonder whether, actually, to come back to the word tipping point, you'll remember, is it Malcolm Gladwell who wrote The Tipping Point, that the behavioural economics side of things? I wonder whether there's an argument for geographers teaming up with behavioural economists to nudge people into doing the right thing, whether that's in terms of what they eat, the way they travel, so that we feel that we have more of a control over it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and a very good example of a geographer who is engaging on the front line would be Mark Maslin, who co-wrote with Simon Lewis a book on the Anthropocene, and Mark put out on his Twitter account, I forget exactly when, at some point in the last couple of years, a kind of a 9-point hit list of things we can do in our own homes. It's kind of an empowering list, and actually I jotted them down. So he says, talk about it, and this is with reference to climate change. Talk about it, switch to a more vegetarian or vegan diet, switch to renewable energy, reduce, reuse and recycle more, use an electric or hybrid car if you can afford it, stop flying, or if you really have to, then offset, divest from fossil fuels, protest and vote. To his list of 9, I would add and understand basic geography. So there you got 9 or 10 points on an action plan for your own kitchen, and I think understanding basic geography is not a big deal. We're talking about year 6 primary level, which is where it's now taught in good primary schools in this country. And if you get it at year 6 primary level as an adult, and even better if you can get it at GCSE level, then you've got it. You really have grasped the essentials, the interconnectedness, the links between human and physical geography, the relationships between cities and countryside, the value of biodiversity. You understand just enough of the science behind David Attenborough's programs to understand why species matter. So we're not talking about having to do a degree in geography or further. We're talking about just the very basic primary and secondary levels.
I wonder how happy you are with the geography curriculum on that basis, because it strikes me that when we're 7 or 8 or even younger, we're actually engaging with geography. We're out there in the forest, we're down at a beach, we're diverting streams or jumping in puddles or whatever it is. And we've got that very visceral connection with basically what a lot of geography is. But then from that year 6 onwards, there is a drop off in interest to GCSE, certainly to A level or IB, and then on to degree levels. So do you see that there's potentially an issue with the curriculum in terms of engaging people, or is it just that people have to make choices?
I wouldn't dare trespass into the world of formal education and start nitpicking about the curriculum, because my own interactions with it would suggest that now that climate change, biodiversity, and so on are being incorporated in state school curriculum in Britain, that we're there, and you couldn't possibly fault the dedication of modern teaching staff. I mean, if you want to be uplifted, go into any modern school. It's impossible to walk out without feeling that you've met truly astonishing, committed people. I do think that a huge issue, a really huge issue, is funding for education. It simply has to be increased. It is the most important field of intellectual endeavour by far, the education of young people. And among the elements of geographical education, which I think have fallen by the wayside, is fieldwork. And it is completely critical. And I don't mean expensive geographical cruises around the Mediterranean or field trips to the Himalayas. I mean, just going out into your own neighborhood with a geography teacher who can explain what you're looking at. And actually, given that well more than half of the world's population now live in cities, we're not talking necessarily about the countryside. You learn a vast amount walking around your own streets and just looking. But if somebody is there to explain to you how the various components of your own neighborhood are interacting, it'll make a lot more sense. There's a very famous New York educationist called Lucy Sprague Mitchell, who was teaching young New Yorkers 100 years ago, and she reckoned that the Manhattan intersection, the crossroads, is one of the most important places in the world to learn geography. And she's completely right. So I think funding and encouragement to fieldwork would make a big difference, because that's the bit when geography comes alive, isn't it? When you're actually out there in the air with your feet on different types of surface, whether you're standing in a glaciated valley in the Lake District or standing between the canyons of high rise in a city, it's actually there around you.
I was just thinking back to my A-level field trips down in Swanage and Studland Bay and Durdledore, and that's really what stays with you. Tell us about which particular field trips stay with you from your studies.
I was at a not very well off state school, so in Norfolk our field trips were very limited. I'm trying to think. I think I might have gone to Cromer once. But actually, no, I'm doing them a disservice. We went the whole way to Dartmoor and actually the erosion of Dartmoor's granite tors has stayed with me ever since. Despite the fact that somehow Cider got involved on a field trip, I remembered enough from it for it to help construct my knowledge of physical geography. But actually, I was very lucky. My school teacher at the school I was at, Mr. Roger Noble, who I went back to see him not long ago. He's retired now, of course, but he changed my life. But he changed it within the classroom. And this was in the days of blackboards and chalk. And I can still see him standing beside the blackboard drawing yardangs and Zeugen. And only those who are interested in the different shapes of Saharan sand dunes would would know exactly what they are, but I was utterly mesmerized. And for me, the shapes of those crescentic sand dunes on a Norfolk classroom wall were just transporting. And we didn't have a television at the time, so that he was my David Attenborough. I could hear the sand grains whistling over the sand dunes as he was describing them. It was very real. He was completely brilliant, and actually, Mr. Noble was responsible more than anybody for getting me into geography.
It's that teacher, isn't it, that just creates the curiosity in you, and curiosity really is the geographer's emotion, the geographer's drive almost.
Yeah, so that's so right. It's odd, isn't it? I think where does curiosity come from? It's very interesting. Where does it come from? Why do we have it? I think it has to occupy a vacuum in our imaginations. Perhaps you can only really mobilize your own curiosity if you've got a space into which it can operate. And perhaps that means, and I'm, the world's worst example of somebody who's kind of hovering around on trying to do too many things at once. But if you go for a walk and you haven't taken any headphones with you, and you've just got the sounds of the space that you're moving through to work with, then your curiosity will take off. You'll start thinking about, why the clouds are that shaped, or why this footpath you're following crosses the, somebody's, in this extraordinary lockdown, and I'm speaking to you from central London, so my open space is the park. And it's quite fascinating the way desire paths have sprung up all over what a year ago was grass, greens, just blank grass. And it's because individuals, groups are starting to find ways of avoiding each other by walking on the tarmac paths. And it's absolutely fascinating because it's almost like having being a witness to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, because what you're watching are knots of people repeatedly following routes that they've devised for themselves. And I look at something, I'm thinking, why is that one going over there? And is it because when you come into the park, you're confronted by people walking towards you down a tarmac path, and you can see two trees at 30 degrees to left, and the trees kind of get your eye, and so you head towards them. And then other people start doing this, and suddenly you've got this new dirt path running across London Park. And of course, that's, back in the day, 10,000 years ago, when hunter-gatherers first moved over the land bridge to what's now Britain, that was the beginning of footpaths that became B roads, that became A roads, that became motorways. That was how the infrastructure of Britain developed, but by individuals fulfilling their curiosity to go and look around the next corner or to try a new route.
That description that you make of the park is, it's a kind of microcosm really of human adaptability, isn't it? And you say that this is why we are the successful species that we are.
Yes, I mean, we have to have faith in our own ability to adapt, don't we, given the challenge that we've got ahead of us. And, just look at the last 12 months, absolutely unbelievable. Who would have guessed 5 years ago that we'd be adapting to a global pandemic in the way that we have? And I think when we stand back from it in years to come, we'll be really surprised at what we achieved. And the toll has been truly terrible. The human toll has been truly terrible. And as will the forecast toll with climate change be truly terrible. It's an appalling prospect. But if we can mobilize the same ambitions of adaptation and of behavioral change to climate, we're going to be able to navigate our way through it, or most of us are. But it will need a huge reversioning of ways of living that we've come to take for granted.
I mean, we've been hearing it over and over again. We're listening to the science. It's wonderful to have that science out there, but I wonder how much we rely on it in our minds, thinking someone will come up with a solution. The engineers will come up with a solution. The physicists, the chemists, the biologists will come up with a solution. And how much geographers have a seat at that table?
Wow, that's a really good and tricky question. Certainly a far more influential seat than they did 10 or 20 years ago. And among in fact, I would argue the organisation that has done the most to embed geographers in policymaking is the Royal Geographical Society, who several years ago set up a unit that now is several thousand strong of geographers within government. This is an interdepartmental group of people with geographical backgrounds who are able to communicate with each other, get together once a year, to share their own geographical insights into their particular areas of operation. And it's long overdue, because as I've argued in my little book, Why Geography Matters, geography, as much as anything, is a way of thinking. And if we go on running communities and countries as if they can be administered in completely self-standing silos, it's all going to come to a rather ugly end, because these silos are not self-standing, they're all interdependent. And we have to understand that, take one example, HS2. The HS2 argument is incredibly complicated, or the tunnel at Stonehenge. Personally, I think it's a truly appalling idea. Why are we building a tunnel under the most famous Mesolithic stroke Neolithic archaeological site in Britain, indeed in Europe, at a time when car use has simply got to decline? Motor cars are not the future. They've only been around for 100 years after all, and we've been living continuously in Britain for 12,000 years. What's the big deal with these independent metal boxes that have only been around for 100 years? Why do we have to adapt the entire landscape for them? It's completely bonkers. Completely bonkers. Sorry, I'll calm down.
I can see that you, with the background, that you are also walking the walk, or rather cycling the talk, shall we say? You're not just talking about it; you are actually kind of living that as well. So geographers are there in government, which is great, because it means then that they are able to kind of hold people to account with that hat on. And I wonder, thinking about holding people to account and actually action coming out of talk, what your thoughts are and hopes, and your realistic hopes for COP26 are later this year. What would you like to see come out of that, and what do you realistically think will?
I'm probably not the best person to ask, because I've had my head down writing a book for the last 12 months. So I'm slightly out of the current thinking, but I will be engaging with it in the next 4 weeks once I've delivered this book. But I think the most important thing to come out of COP is it would be if you like, a fantasy, but it is to come up with a global Green New Deal that of the kind that Naomi Klein has written about, that caps consumption and CO2 emissions at such a level that we're not simply going to bust straight through 2 degrees centigrade and land hundreds of millions of people in poverty or worse. I think if the same kind of global effort can be mobilized at COP as has been mobilized in the last 12 months to deal with this global pandemic, then it'll be the first time since the 70s that my inner soul starts to feel cheery about the future of the planet. I've got books upstairs in my sort of climate change shelf dating from 1974-5, one of them by the United Nations, warning that it's called Only One Earth, and it's written by 2 scientists who had been at a UN conference, and they warned that any global temperature increases of more than 2 degrees would lead to catastrophic consequences. But that was the early 1970s. And we've frittered away 50 years, literally frittered away 50 years. So if the approach of COP can be prepared for as if we can see an approaching global pandemic, then we'll get somewhere, because it does need a global response. And I really, really hope that the UK can take the lead with this in a really courageous way. Because after all, I think the UK led the way for the world into industrial revolutions. We, more than any other nation, showed how to consume fossil fuels at scale. And I think, in a sense, if you look at the kind of global story, we're beholden to lead the world into a post-fossil fuel existence, sustainable existence. It would be something that would make many of us in the UK walk very tall to lead the way. And I think it would be a unifying strategy, something that we can all buy into within the country. And it's something that our children could obviously believe in too. It's their world.
The optics for that look fantastic, but you, me, many of the people watching will know that sometimes you are involved in organisations where there is the best intention and there's a lot of talk, but things kind of get kicked down the road. And so I wonder whether the difficulty of the comparison with the pandemic is that the pandemic affects us this hour, this day, this week, and people that we know and love today. Whereas when we're looking at a much longer span, a longer term goal, we're looking at net zero carbon by 2050. It seems so way off that it's difficult almost in the human consciousness to kind of gather ourselves around that and to have purpose with it.
Yeah, and I think the issue is one way of addressing that is to think about the beneficial spin-offs that we can enjoy by addressing acute climate change. And the most obvious one would be a reduction in pollution. If we use cars and planes less, the air we breathe will become cleaner. Our quality of life will actually go up. It doesn't all have to be sacrifice. In fact, I would argue that every aspect of addressing climate change will lead to a higher quality of life for all of us, both individually and collectively. It's so I don't see it as being a qualitative cost to address climate change. It's certainly a massive adjustment, but we've all had to massively adjust this year. We know how to do that. In terms of kind of the sort of temporal horizon, the idea that you talked about, which is that it's more difficult to think urgently about something that always seems to have a distant horizon, 2030. The one at the end of the century is the one that annoys me more than anything, as if, somehow nothing happens after the end of the century. Well, for those who have children, that'll be the age of our grandchildren. They'll be living through that time. What does it sound like to an 8-year-old to hear people in their 60s talking about the end of the century as if it doesn't matter what happens after that? It's insulting to young people, and so we have to stop that. And there's been an incredible change in approach in the last 2 or 3 years. Look, the BBC only I think it was last year first started putting climate crisis straplines on news broadcasts. Climate crisis. Well, that's new. When I was recording Coast, we were not really allowed to talk about climate change without having what I saw as the opposing view, denying view, which was maddening. But that has all changed, and the language of climate change is much more current. It's with us all the time. And I think that also the other thing is that whether we like it or not, we've now moved into a global era where the implications of climate change are actually a daily occurrence. So they're not, we don't have to look to 20, 30, 40 or 50 or the end of the century to witness a climate event. Nearly every day there's a climate event now. And one of the brilliant things, for example, about that, I urge everybody to look at the Met Office website. They have a very, we think of the Met Office, the British Met Office, as being, where you go and look at the forecast and find out whether you should go for a bike ride or a picnic tomorrow or not. Actually, they've got a very good climate change section. And if you start looking at the Met Office website, you'll see that actually there are many, many events now, perhaps even the cold snap that's covering the north of England and snow at the moment, that are attributable to a warming climate. Moving jet streams, speeding up jet streams, sudden shifts and so on. There's all sorts of things happening. You could even argue, and some are, that actually, we've now moved beyond the age of weather being, if you like, a natural phenomenon, and it's all being climate tweaked. It's always been climate tweaked, but I mean tweaked by humankind.
Let's talk maps, Nick, because this is Stanford's. It would be rude not to talk maps, really. And it would be wonderful if we might start with Mercator, who I know is a particular hero of yours.
Yeah, Mercator saw himself as a geographer, and he lived in the actually through most of the 1500s. He lived into his 80s. He was born in 1512 in what is now Flanders in the Low Countries, a very flat, a part of Europe as flat as a map, which I don't think is coincidental that he then became what, to my mind, is the world's greatest map maker. I became very absorbed by his life and his achievements and his character. He was, to my mind, he was the perfect geographer. He lived in an age of great tumult during the religious Reformation, when Europe was polarized between Lutherans and Catholics, and he refused to align himself with either extreme. He was an anti-extremist. He occupied the most dangerous place of all, the middle, the no man's land between the two extremes. And so he was persecuted by both, particularly Catholics. He was locked up by the Spanish Inquisition. But through all of this, he believed that describing the world's geography would bring people together, that it would be a harmonizing activity. It was a beautiful life lived, and he's known for his maps, but he tried to write a history of the cosmos. Not surprisingly, he died before it's finished. But what he's really well known for is what he called his modern maps. He produced over 100 of them of the world, and they were, although he didn't travel himself, he never really left the Low Countries in northern Germany. He assembled his cartographic material from ship's captains, navigators. He used to go to the Frankfurt Book Fair every year to buy manuscript maps, manuscript versions of Marco Polo and so on. They bring them all back home to either, when he was in the Low Countries, to his home there, or to Duisburg in Germany where he lived. And then he would editorialize all this geographical information into his modern maps. And the interesting thing about his modern maps were that they were not, unlike medieval maps, they were not covered in sea monsters and ships and conjectural Edens and this kind of thing. They were mathematical. They were immediately recognizable as a sort of prototype Ordnance Survey map. They carried the features that you expect to see on the map: the towns, the villages, the mountains, the rivers, the coasts. And where possible, he used geographical information that had been produced by surveying, because this was the beginning of triangulation, mathematical surveying, and he was a great proponent of it. And then his kind of, if you like, his tour de force was the binding of all of these modern maps, 110, 115 of them or so, into a book that he called Atlas. And it was the first time that a book of maps had been called Atlas. And so he coined a term that we now use as a common noun, an atlas. And he's very modest. he never sought fame, and he was devoted to describing the planet. He was, to my mind, the perfect geographer. He was clearly utterly fascinated by the way the world worked, both its human and physical dimensions, and he wanted to harmonize the whole. He saw the globe as this very beautiful element of creation, or the element of creation.
And how much did he, like so many of us human beings, put himself or his part of the world in the center of the map and look out?
Yeah. Well, I think I know what you're heading towards there, Julia. So Mercator's projection, which is, if you like, along with the atlas, is probably better known for Mercator's projection, because if you look at the bottom of many modern maps, including the NASA website, if you look at the NASA website, you'll see that much of the solar system has been mapped on something called Mercator's projection. There are many different types of projection. And a projection is the means of, if you like, flattening a spherical globe into a two-dimensional map. So it's flattening 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions. But of course, if you do that, you're going to get distortion on the 2-dimensional version because of stretching or gaps. And so Mercator, he came up with his projection because he wanted to devise a projection that allowed a compass bearing to remain the same whether you stood on the surface of the curved globe, for example, on the deck of a ship, or whether you were standing with that compass resting on a 2-dimensional flat map. He wanted to create the, if you like, the perfect projection that allowed that compass bearing to be the same. Because if he could do that, he realized that, for example, a seafarer could decide to set off from a place at 283 degrees, set the compass, and then go out onto the deck of the ship, set the compass to 283, and it would take him to the place that the map said it would do. And until his projection, that was not possible. It's a work of complete genius. Now, unfortunately, what happened is that the diagram he drew to explain how his projection worked showed the world flattened in 2 dimensions with Europe right in the middle. And forever after, he's been accused of creating a Eurocentric world map. But he's been accused by people who don't read the legend on his map, which says that it's an aid for navigation. It's not a political description of the world. It's just an aid to navigation. But, you know, when I was at school, I've got my school atlas a few feet away. You know, you open it and the world map is on Mercator projection with Europe slap bang in the middle. And of course, it's massively annoying for people who don't live in Europe because they feel marginalised all of the time. I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't have a Mercator projection of the world with New Zealand or Zambia or Ecuador in the middle of the map. It would work just as well.
Let's stay with maps for a moment, because I think it's really interesting to look at them through the prism of what it tells us about the culture that produced them. And so I was thinking about OS maps actually, and how, you know, how useful they are, and actually how, I mean, I love an OS map, all those things, it takes me right back. But I was thinking, what the symbols that are chosen to go on that OS map, what does it say about Britain? And actually, what does it say about Britain today? So, for example, the church symbols. Do we really worry in contemporary Britain whether a church has a spire or whether it has a tower? Are we worried about where a post office is? We may well be worried where a public house is, a pub is, but I wonder whether, you know, is there an argument for taking some of those symbols away and perhaps adding others?
Well, that's a really, really great question. I would say that we have to think about the permanence of structures. That's one issue. So, although the Ordnance Survey maps I grew up with were all printed on paper, and there are, you know, there were artifacts to keep. Often, I've kept all the ones I've ever owned. I'm ashamed to say I've got about 1,000 Ordnance Survey maps upstairs, but and I use them a lot. But you didn't they weren't like digital maps that could be updated every hour, whereas the Ordnance Survey now does have a national digital map that can be updated on a daily basis. So I guess there might be an argument on digital mapping for putting, for example, mobile phone masts on, but mobile phone masts are always coming and going. Whereas a church spire is on the whole not going to go. Once it's there, it's going to stay. And I'd also argue that actually Ordnance survey maps are, it's only one of their uses, but they're a wonderful historical document. If you are going for a walk or a bike ride or a drive through the countryside exploring, then you can use these symbols like a church tower to navigate. Or you can, if you're going for a walk using a 1 to 25,000 scale Ordnance survey map, if you're going to try and cross Dartmoor, which is a notoriously difficult place to navigate across, you're going to set off, and you mustn't do this unless you're very, very skilled at map and compass and dead reckoning. You're going to set off, and within about 10 minutes, you're going to really be looking very closely at that OS map for those little spiky tufts, which tell you that you're going to probably sink up to your knees in water. So knowing where, I forget what the OS calls that, but bog or marsh probably. So knowing where those are and where the solid ground is really matters if you're going for a walk. I mean, they are, when you think about it, the Ordnance survey maps, to my mind, they are the best topographical maps in the world. But what we should think about with them is not so much what they've got on them, but how much has been left off them. And of course, you have to leave information off, because otherwise they become so cluttered that you can't use them. They're not clear enough. And so the real trick with using an Ordnance survey map, if you're using it for navigation, is to always ask yourself, okay, so what might be missing? You're walking across a mountain ridge, and you've got the contour lines, you've got the rock outcrops marked, but there's a lot of things that won't be marked. You could easily have a short vertical drop that falls between the contour lines. It's certainly, far enough to break your leg if you go over the edge of it. So it's not as if you can just use a map and walk around with your eyes shut. You've got to think about what's in the gaps. But I'm sure, you'd have to ask the Ordnance survey, but I'm sure they do regularly review topographical features that they're marking. And you can think of some of the obvious ones, like motorways that's crisscrossing all of our maps these days, big blue, thick arterial lines. But I can think of one that disappeared. There used to be a symbol for military sites, I think, that were, or was were they not shown? No, there was a category of military sites that were not to be shown on Ordnance survey maps. I think those have now appeared, but not identified. And I can remember many years ago when I walked in a straight line following the line of 2 degrees west longitude from the Scottish border to the English Channel, coming across at least one of these sites. I was walking along with my compass, dead straight line down the middle of England, and then suddenly came across this massive set of sort of warehouses and barbed wire fences, absolutely nothing on the map at all, just open fields. So there are things that you won't find on the map that do exist on the ground.
You mentioned the maps in your house, and I can imagine that you've got an absolute treasure trove there of books and maps, haven't you?
I do, and in fact, let me show you this one, Julie. I got, because I can do it because I'm sitting at home talking to you. I lifted off the shelf this Stanford's treasure. It's called Europe. It was edited by Sir Andrew Ramsay, and it was given to my wife Annabelle and I as a wedding present by a very close friend, Chris Bradley. It was published in 1885 by Edward Stanford in Charing Cross Road. And it was a reminder, and look at this beautiful map. I mean, it was a reminder that Stanford's, here we are, here's Stanford's, look at that stunning map of the Mediterranean, absolutely gorgeous. And Stanford's always understood the value of geography, right from the start. And this book is one of many they published, and was the standard text on Europe. So it's got everything from description of the Apennines, both physical and the role of the Apennines in classical history. It's got alpine plants, it's got biogeography, human geography, it's got the Elbe running across Germany, the minerals of France. Everything you should ever need to know about Europe is in this book. And they really did understand it. And then I've got another book here I picked off the shelves too. So just going even further back, this is a book that I used when I was researching my Mercator book. It's called Tudor Geography, and it's by a very famous cartographic historian called E.G.R. Taylor. And this whole book is about the value of geography and its applications in the Tudor age. There's a map of the habitable world. Not really recognisable, but there's E.G.R. Taylor's map of the habitable world. Geography stretches the whole way back from Stanford's modern shop in Covent Garden with all of its Ordnance Survey maps and books related to travel and so on, all the way back through time. You can track geography actually back into the age of hunting and gathering, because if we hadn't been innate geographers, we wouldn't have been able to find our way to food sources and shelter. So we were mentally mapping long before we were reading and writing. So long before the age of formal mapping, we were able to walk across the land bridge from the continent across what is now the North Sea into what is now Norfolk, and then set off onto this peninsula, this northwest peninsula of Europe, looking for herds of auroch to hunt these gigantic wild cattle. And if we did find a herd of auroch, then we would have both memorized exactly where we found them and also created a mental map of that location so we could go back and find them. So we would have had to be drawing mental maps to find our way back to bivouac sites, to know where to find flint, which was the main source of raw material for weapons and tools. So this idea that geography is new is erroneous. It's with us, it's innate. We are all geographers. Always have been.
There's a phrase that you use within the book, talking about landscapes and places being memory banks, and related to the stories that we tell ourselves.
Yes, I nicked a lot of ideas in the book from much more intelligent people than me, and this is something that came from two psychologists called Godden and Baddeley, who did some research on the way that memory works, and were able to prove that locations can be used as places to reboot our memories. So that if you need to remind yourself, for example, about members of your family, or about family happenings, or about something that happened in the past related to your family, then you're more likely to be able to rekindle that memory by being in the house where those memories were rooted, or going to a picnic place where you're all together, or going back to a place where you're on holiday. So that's what Godden and Baddeley were arguing, that actually you can rekindle memory, reboot it by going back to particular places. Now, that of course raised some really interesting notions about the way the landscape works. So the reason I use it as a memory bank, it's rather like using a landscape imagining a landscape as if it's dotted with thousands and thousands of personal servers that are waiting for you to go back there, and then to provide you with this lost data, this lost information. And as soon as I read their paper, and I was put onto it by my son Kit, who at the time was reading psychology at Sussex Uni, and he told me about Godden and Baddeley. And as soon as I read it, it was just like a light switching on, because I realised how often I'd been doing exactly that. I go back to a place, often not entirely sure why I'd gone there, but as soon as I'm there, all of these memories just start crowding in. And one of the reasons that it fascinated me is that when I was researching a book I wrote called The Making of the British Landscape, I was wondering about places like Stonehenge and a lot of the standing stones, megaliths, tombs. The landscape's dotted with hundreds of thousands of prehistoric sites, and we don't know exactly how they were used, because there's no written record. The definition of prehistory is that there is no historical written record of what was going on. And actually, prehistory in Britain lasted for the first 8,000 years or so of our 12,000 year occupation. And so it's a very long part of our story in Britain. And so perhaps you could, I think it'd be foolish not to look at places like Stonehenge as if they weren't also, if you like, servers, memory banks, places that people are going back to rekindle memories, not just acquaintances, probably with other people in other bits of Britain, or causewayed enclosures, a very strange, one of the earliest Neolithic landforms is in Britain. Not defensive because there were huge circular henge structures with a ditch and bank, but they had gaps around the perimeter, so people could come into them and leave them. What were they for? There are many theories, but I could imagine them being, I call them social enclosures in my book. I could imagine them being used as congregation places in the way that we might nowadays use Trafalgar Square or a church, or the O2 Centre, places where people came together and then shared something. And one of the things they might have been sharing were memories, rebooting their memories. Because remember, there's no paper, no pencils, there's no computers or laptops to record your family's digital photos. It's all in your head. So there's that daily kind of attrition of memory going on in that time. And one way of keeping it alive would be to go to these places where you could reboot it.
It's almost everything changes, but nothing changes, really, isn't it? Within that book, The Making of the British Landscape, one of the sort of themes that you explore is the tension between towns and countryside, which there has been for a long, long time.
Yeah, it always has been, and there always will be. And we went through a critical transition not long ago to a world that's now mostly urban, which of course has never happened before. It's always been a mostly rural world, but we're now in a mostly urban world, and that trend certainly in Europe and in Britain is continuing to a more urban situation. And the tension, and I speak as a city dweller, is it's palpable, isn't it? Many of my family live in quite remote places outside London, and I kind of get this mirror image. I go to see them, and I can see this show, what William Cobbett called the Great Wen, this disgusting, great, big, distant blob called London on the right. That's out of sight but not out of mind. That's somehow full of all the evils of the world, and yet I'm drawn to it by an incredibly strong magnetic urban field, and fascinated by it as well, and live in it. But I don't think there's any way of diluting attention, but I do think there's a way of cities becoming exemplars of sustainable communities. And I know we have rural and semi-rural communities that are that already, places like Totnes, Britain's first transition town, which has shown brilliantly how relatively small, compact communities can show the way. But when you're looking at cities of several million, it's much more complicated, because somewhere like London is a collection of hundreds, if not thousands, of Totneses, all nudged up against each other. So it's much more complicated. So the systems have to be incredibly complex. What you do get in cities is this scaling effect, where if you double the population, you don't need to double the number of gas stations. The American geographer worked out that, for example, I think he was looking at Los Angeles, if you double the population of Los Angeles, you only need 85% more gas stations to keep all of those people's vehicles fueled. So cities can offer a lot for the future in terms of sustainability, because actually it creates a lesser impact on the planet for people to live in a connected city, in a city type community where food deliveries and essentials can be undertaken in a very efficient way. But I think it's part of the fascinating fabric of Britain that we have both. And I mean, I would go completely nuts if I couldn't imagine the countryside existing. I'm going nuts. I'm stuck in central London dreaming about the countryside, and just desperate to go and climb a mountain. So we all need both. It would be impossible to live in the countryside without the economic benefits of cities and the services provided by cities. The two need each other. They're interdependent. So yeah, the tension exists. I don't think it's always very productive. It's and you don't have to be one or the other. Personally, I think we country dwellers and city dwellers need each other, and they need both landscapes. It's the whole that matters. And I think one of the things that struck me making all of the coast television programs, going round and round the coast for 10 years, is that how strong a sense of identity, how much a sense of identity on an island is created by this cut-off caused by the coast. We don't have a permeable edge across which ideas and practices very easily transmit. It's quite a defined edge, and therefore, perhaps it's not surprising in Britain as islanders that we tend to stand with our backs to the sea, looking inward, and what we see is town and country. I wonder, I'd be fascinated to know whether town and country is such a big deal in a landlocked country like Switzerland.
Very interesting to think about. We are all locked down at the moment, which means that we have time. And I wonder whether either you're aware of what's being studied in geography departments at the moment around the country in relation to COVID and the pandemic, because if ever there was a time for geography, then looking at the things that led to that and the way that we might get out of it and the interconnectedness and everything, it seems to be the moment. Or perhaps what you think should be being looked at by those geography departments in relation to what we're going through right now. I'm thinking in terms of poverty, inequality, perhaps, and all of those things which are central to geography, but we're having a whole brand new case study and example of.
Yeah, I think, and certainly two of our household are both doing university degrees at the moment in international development from the kitchen or various spaces around this building. So I'm kind of aware of what they're working on, and it's too early. But I'm not actually in the university department, so I can't say there's any certainty. But I think it's too early for the pandemic to have crept in any comprehensive way into curricula. But international development is something that's been studied for a very long time, and certainly if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the list of 17 goals that were meant to be achieved by 2030. Poverty, inequality, right up there, and those are both two elements of the UN's SDG list that have been thrown into relief by the pandemic. That poverty and inequality appear to be factors in the density of transmission, and I'm sure these will end up next year on geography courses. I think it's too early yet. The stats are all so fresh, aren't they? But it must be a topic of conversation surely in online teaching on that already. But I'm afraid I don't know. Maybe I ought to eavesdrop more on the lectures going on.
I'm just thinking that we're going to be inundated with PhD theories and therefore courses for the future on the pandemic. A little bit like in other forms of literature, there will be COVID novels for the next 5 years.
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to happen. I think there's a, I think there's a shock element that we haven't yet taken on board. I mean, just today's figures are so shocking that I can't really even begin to imagine it. And I'm talking to somebody who's lost both my parents in the last 12 months or so. But the sheer scale of COVID-related deaths is now so enormous that it's incredibly difficult to imagine. And that's going to take a really long time to sink in, and I think it would be, there's going to be, I think there's going to be the immediate adjustment, which we're all making on a day-by-day basis, and then there's going to be about 5 years or whatever it might be from now, we're going to, people have written papers, there will be the books, and stand back from it and say, right, well, that was really something. And of course it is. There's been nothing like this, certainly in my lifetime, and you really have to go back in the UK to the Second World War to find anything that's been as nationally catastrophic. So it's it's a huge one, and I think it's often the case. I've noticed this with expeditions. If I've been on a very difficult journey and everything's gone really hot, and I'm hanging on by the skin of my teeth on a ridge with a tent blowing down, I'm on my own. I've got no communications, and I've got food run out, and there's a desperate situation. When you're in the midst of it, and it's life or death, you're so preoccupied with getting through the next 5 minutes or hour. Sometimes you might make a plan for the rest of the night, so that you know what to do when the sun rises, or when it won't rise in a storm, when light returns. Actually, when you're in the middle of it, you can't possibly have that longer view. So it's going to be a number of years before we have the long view on the pandemic. I'm certain of that.
Yeah, makes sense of it. Well, I'm glad you made it back from the edge of that ridge and the tent blowing away and so on. We can't let you go, Nick, without asking you about that book which you referred to earlier, the one that you're delivering at the moment. Are you able to say anything about it, the content, and when it might be out?
Yes, it's coming out in May, and I was very lucky. I was offered an amazing project by Michael Joseph, a part of Penguin, to write the story of the 1735 geodesic mission to the equator, which is a French and Spanish expedition to measure the shape of the Earth. And as a writer, what more could you ask for in the midst of a pandemic than a rip-roaring story? And I didn't have access to my favourite places, the British Library, or the London Library, or the Royal Geographical Society Library. So I've been sitting where I am talking to you, writing this book using web sources and my own imagination, and it's been a complete joy. I've loved it. It's been a massively helpful distraction. So it's been published in May, and by Michael Joseph, and I'm copy editing at the moment, so I'm a few days from handing it over. Yeah, it's going to be called Latitude, because it's really at heart, it is the story of the discovery of latitude, the measuring of latitude.
Yeah, I can't wait to read it. It's fantastic. So you'll have to come back to Stanford and tell us all about it next time, promise?
I absolutely promise. I would love to. I'd be thrilled.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Nick, thanks so much for being with us today. It's been an absolute treat to listen to your stories and for you to explain so comprehensively why geography matters. Thanks to everybody for watching and for being here. Do please go onto the website, the Stanford's website, when Nick's book is available. Have an extra look there, look at the blurb, pick it up metaphorically, as it were, and take a look around. Nick, thanks for your time. Thanks for your stories. Thanks for being with us. And we wish you all the very best.
Thank you, Julia. As ever, such a pleasure chatting, and good luck with the rest of the festival. I'm looking forward to logging on and being distracted by lots of wonderful travel books.
Another great session there. Thanks to Nicholas Crane and Julia Wheeler. If you were inspired during that session, do click over to the Stanford's virtual stand, where you can buy a copy of Why Geography Matters and also explore all the other wonderful things they have going on.